Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunted Bedtime. I know many of you tune in to these stories to help you drift off to sleep. So before you settle in, I'd love for each of you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. It was a warm summer weekend night, the perfect time for friends to gather, eat, drink, and enjoy each other's company. This was something we did often, entertaining friends, sharing good food, and having a good time. After we had our fill, we cleared the table to play a few rounds of Pente, a competitive board game. If you haven't tried it, it's a lot of fun. After a couple of hours, I decided to sit out the next few rounds. I stepped out onto the deck, hoping to enjoy the quiet night sky and relax with a cigarette. The stars above were breathtaking, so clear and bright, almost inviting me to stay and watch a while. Then I had a sudden idea. Grabbing a cushion from one of the deck chairs, I headed to the truck. I dropped the tailgate, hopped into the back, and stretched out, using the cushion as a makeshift pillow. As I lay there, I could hear my friends inside still laughing and playing. It was a perfect moment. I lay there for about 20 minutes, studying the stars, listening to the sounds of the Arkansas night, and hoping to catch sight of a shooting star. Occasionally, laughter and cheers would erupt from inside the house, making me feel content and lucky to have such moments in my life. But then, out of nowhere, something happened that I'll never forget. Suddenly, right next to me, a voice started talking. Jennifer's voice. It came out of nowhere, and it scared me so badly that I nearly jumped out of my skin. Without thinking, I bolted over the side of the truck, not even bothering with the tailgate. I was looking everywhere, sure that someone had been sitting in the truck with me, but there was no one. I sprinted back to the deck, up the stairs, and through the back door in record time. Once inside, I tried to get a grip on what had just happened. I didn't want to freak everyone out, so I tried to play it cool. But the moment they saw me, it was obvious something was up. "You're white as a ghost," they said. No pun intended. That's exactly what they said. So I told a few of them what happened. Still feeling shaken, I stayed inside for a bit, but something urged me to go back out. And yes, I know. Why would I go back out there? I can't really explain it, but I knew I wasn't going alone this time. I grabbed a neighbor friend, and we both went out onto the deck. We stood there for a while, talking about what had just happened, when everyone else eventually came outside to join us. I was still on edge, but tried to stay calm as the conversations continued. I sat down in a chair, without a cushion of course, because there was no way I was going back to the truck to get the one I'd used. That's when Sophie, our dog, jumped onto my lap. We were all chatting when, out of nowhere, Sophie started barking at the wall behind me. She'd never done anything like that before, and hasn't since. Everyone turned to look at her, then at the wall, and back at me. As they did, I suddenly felt it. An icy cold spot just above my left shoulder. My eyes must have widened, because everyone started staring at me. The left side of my head, ear, and the back of my neck were freezing. And keep in mind, this was a warm Arkansas night. We don't have cold spots like that. I tried to calm Sophie down, but she was having none of it. I handed her over to Jennifer, who took her inside, while the rest of us gathered around the wall, staring at the spot where I had been sitting. And yes, by this point, I had definitely moved. For a while, we just stood there, with some of us reaching into the cold zone, trying to feel the strange temperature change until it slowly faded away. Looking back, everyone there was used to weird things happening around our place, but not quite like this. In hindsight, I don't think whatever it was meant to scare me. It was the shock, the surprise that got me. But what really puzzles me is why it used Jennifer's voice. I didn't even stick around long enough to find out what it wanted to say. I wonder what would have happened if I had handled it differently, if I had stayed. But hey, you can't change the past. We live, and we learn. I thought I'd take a moment to mention some cool, and not so cool, things that have been happening around our house lately. We love the outdoors here in Arkansas, and this year we've been lucky with a mild summer. It's given us plenty of chances to be outside. However, living in a rural area near several ponds means one thing: mosquitoes, and lots of them. To keep them at bay, we use a handy gadget called a thermocell. It's a small device that uses a propane cell to heat up a treated pad that repels mosquitoes. To turn it on, you have to click the ignition button, which takes quite a bit of pressure to activate. When we're not using them, we store our 2 thermocells on a shelf in the utility room just off the kitchen. One morning, as we were rushing around getting ready for work, we suddenly heard a very distinctive clicking sound. We both froze in our tracks and looked at each other, as it had clicked 3 times and stopped. Just as we were asking each other if we both heard it, it clicked again, twice more. We turned our heads toward the utility room, and I said, "That sounded like the thermocell." Sure enough, as if in response, it clicked again. We walked the 8 feet to the utility room, staring at the shelves where the thermocells sat. We stood there only a moment when, click, click, right in front of us. We couldn't see the top of the device to confirm the button was being pressed, but it was only 2 feet away. We both stepped back, amazed. It was like the universe was saying, "In your face! You didn't miss that, did you?" We laughed about it, and I picked up each device to test them. Each thermocell has its own distinct clicking sound, so we knew exactly which one had made the noise. We weren't sure if something had physically pressed the button, or if something had just mimicked the sound. Either way, we thought it was cool and headed off to work with grins on our faces. The next incident wasn't as amusing. This happened just this past Friday night. We decided to take it easy and were sitting on the love seat, watching a movie. We'd been watching for a while when, suddenly, the smoke alarm in our changing room behind us went off. Naturally, I jumped up and ran to see what was wrong, expecting to find something on fire. But there was no smoke, no fire. Everything looked normal. We turned on the lights, sniffed the air, and checked every inch of the room and the adjoining bathroom. There was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. I checked the smoke alarm, and it seemed fine. I'd just replaced the battery during the last time change, so I was confident it wasn't a low battery issue. And strangely, the alarm had only screeched twice before stopping. Satisfied that everything was okay, we went back to watching the movie. But about 20 minutes later, it happened again. This time, I checked everything again and found nothing. Then it hit me. I grabbed a measuring stick from the utility room, went back to the changing room, and used the stick to press the test button on the smoke alarm. Sure enough, it made the same 2 long screeching sounds. That's when I realized something had been pressing the test button, and that made me mad. I said out loud, "That's not cool. That's not a toy to play with. We rely on that for our safety." After that second time, it hasn't happened again. I'll add that the alarm has never done this before. Normally, when it goes off, it's a continuous screech, not just 2 sounds. It only makes that particular sound when the test button is pressed. We've had plenty of smoky moments in the kitchen and know exactly how the alarms behave, and this was something different. So, those are some of the cool and uncool things that have happened in our house recently. In some of my previous stories, I've mentioned that I work in the county circuit clerk's office. We're responsible for preserving most of the county's records, including land deeds, mortgages, civil and criminal records. Basically, a lot of historical documents. Our records go all the way back to the early to mid-1800s, and because most of these are public, we regularly have researchers from various companies visiting to sift through our vault. This particular courthouse was built in the mid-1940s, replacing the original courthouse, which dated back to the late 1800s. The building itself holds a lot of history. Our vault, located right behind my desk, is about 20 feet by 40 feet. It's lined with rows of large cabinets filled with books, with 3 of the walls fully covered. In the back corner is a metal spiral staircase leading down to what we call the dungeon, which is the same size as the vault above and contains even more old records. Over the years, my coworkers and I have experienced some strange things, most of which seem to be residual. For instance, we've often heard the sound of pages rustling, as if someone were flipping through one of the large books. But with the vault being climate controlled, there's no way a draft or breeze could be causing it. One incident that stands out happened back in November. I was alone in the office during lunch when I suddenly heard the familiar sound of pages rustling. My ears perked up as I tried to hear more. Then I heard the distinct sound of a chair moving. I quickly ran through a mental checklist of who could be back there, but realized everyone was still out at lunch. I got up, walked the 5 steps to the vault, and no one was there. I did a quick check of the entire vault, just to reassure myself, but it was empty. Grinning, I walked over to the chairs and pushed them back under the desk where they belonged. I went back to my desk and resumed working, but not 5 minutes later, I heard a chair move again. This time, I jumped up and immediately looked into the vault. Sure enough, one of the chairs had been pulled back about 6 inches. Chills ran down my spine, and while it was a bit unnerving, I couldn't help but think it was pretty cool. When my coworkers returned from lunch, I told them what had happened, and ever since, they've been keeping an eye on that area too. Fast forward to about 2 weeks ago. One of my coworkers, whose desk faces the vault, had her own encounter. She told me that while I was out to lunch, she saw the same chair move. This time, it pulled out and then pushed back in very quickly. Strangely, there was no sound at all, just the movement. That's just one of the odd things that have been happening lately. There have been other strange occurrences too, like someone tapping me on the head or maps being pulled from the walls. I think most of the activity might be residual energy from past researchers, but some of the incidents suggest that something more might be going on. It was Christmas morning, around 2 a.m., when I found myself wide awake. After tossing and turning for what felt like forever, I finally gave up on trying to fall back asleep. Quietly, I got out of bed and closed the door behind me, thinking I'd sit at the dining table, scroll through some social media, and hopefully get sleepy again. Sitting there with the house quiet except for the ticking of various clocks, I began to unwind. About 10 minutes in, though, I started to hear something unusual. A tapping sound coming from the living room. Tap, 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 tap. I paused, setting my phone down to listen closely. The tapping was odd, deliberate, and loud enough to stand out. It seemed to be coming from one of the area rugs covering the hardwood floor, but it was just out of my line of sight. Tap, tap, tap. I got out of my chair and crept toward the sound. Slowly, I made my way into the living room, carefully trying to get a better look. I was just one step away from seeing the source when, tap, tap, step, it stopped. The moment I came into view, the sound disappeared. I stood there for a few seconds, hoping it might start up again, but nothing. Feeling a bit frustrated that it had stopped, I decided to sit down on the love seat in the living room. I waited, listening patiently, but after 10 minutes, it seemed like the tapping was done for the night. I grabbed the remote and turned the TV on low, figuring I'd watch something until I got sleepy again. But just as I was getting comfortable, I heard a sound. This time, it was coming from behind me. Tink, tink, tink. The same pattern and volume as before, but now coming from the window right behind the dining chair I had been sitting in earlier. I grinned, already knowing what would happen if I stood up to investigate. So instead, I had an idea. Grabbing the remote, I positioned myself with my thumb hovering over the mute button. Tink, tink, mute. Tink. I caught it. I actually caught it making one last sound before stopping completely. I couldn't help but chuckle, saying something like, "Got ya." I stood up and walked over to the window, tapping on it myself. Sure enough, it sounded exactly the same. Then, I went back to the living room and tapped on the floor, searching for the spot where the first tapping had originated. I found that depending on where I tapped, the sound changed slightly, especially near the furniture. Fast forward to last week, something even stranger happened. After dinner, Jennifer and I cleaned up the kitchen and settled down on the love seat to watch TV. Sophie, our dog, was fast asleep on the ottoman in front of us. Everything was quiet and peaceful when, all of a sudden, we heard a noise that neither of us could believe. It was the unmistakable sound of someone or something passing gas. I kid you not. It wasn't overly loud, but it was clear enough to sound like someone standing just 5 to 6 feet away had let one rip. Jennifer and I exchanged glances and then burst out laughing. It was a first for us, for sure. Now I have to wonder, can spirits pass gas? I wouldn't think so. Maybe it was just trying to be funny? Whatever the reason, it definitely made us laugh. It hasn't happened since, but now we're constantly on alert, expecting the unexpected. Over the past several weeks, we've been hearing more and more little things. We're even thinking about coming up with ways to keep this playful spirit and ourselves entertained. It was a typical Saturday night. Friends, campfires, good food, and laughter. As the night wore on, most of the guests had already said their goodbyes. Jennifer and I were sitting by the fire, making small talk as we watched the flames die down. Eventually, Jennifer decided to head inside to tidy up as our last guest left. I stayed outside, quite comfortable, and told her I'd poke the fire a bit before coming in. My chair was facing the house, and I stirred the fire while sitting. Leaning back in my chair, I gazed up at the stars, enjoying the quiet of the night. But after only a minute, I noticed something strange. The sounds around me began to muffle. It was like my ears were stopping up, but there was no pressure in them, nothing that felt physical. I was still trying to figure out what was happening when suddenly I felt it. A huge pressure laid itself on top of me, as if something incredibly heavy had sat right in my lap. I couldn't move. My first instinct was to jump up, but I couldn't budge. I had no control over my body. My arms, my legs, nothing would respond. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was completely and utterly helpless under the weight pressing down on me. This terrifying event lasted about 3 to 4 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. All at once, the weight was gone, and the sounds of the night returned. I shot up from my chair and bolted toward the house as fast as I could, my heart racing. By the time I reached the door, I was a complete mess, shaking from head to toe, tears streaming down my face. I've never been held captive like that before in my life. Those 3 to 4 minutes left me completely powerless. I felt violated, unable to control my own body. Bursting through the door, I screamed for Jennifer. She met me in the living room, and I collapsed onto the couch, frantically scanning the room for anything that might have followed me inside. As I sat there, my fingers tingled intensely, as if they were electrified. It was like an electric current was running through them, and I was still shaken, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I managed to explain everything to Jennifer, though she was just as confused as I was. Neither of us knew what to make of it. Over time, the electric feeling in my fingers faded, and I began to calm down, but the whole experience left me exhausted and unsettled. Was it paranormal? I think it was. As many of you know, we often have guests, spirits, coming and going. Could this have been one of them? I'm not sure. Maybe some of you can help me figure it out. This happened about 2.5 years ago, and thankfully, it hasn't happened since. I didn't go back outside that night, and I was pretty scared the next few times I sat by the campfire. Eventually, that fear faded, but the memory remains. I still think about it from time to time, especially when I'm out there alone by the fire. Last weekend, my husband, my brother, his girlfriend, and I stayed for 2 nights at the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. We booked room 101, which used to be Norman Baker's office when he ran his so-called cancer hospital. On our first night, we stayed up late, but nothing unusual happened in our room. Around 3:30 a.m., we decided to explore the hotel. We took pictures in front of some of the rooms we'd heard were haunted, and I took tons of photos in the hallways. I caught some orbs, but I was hoping for something more tangible. I stood in front of room 218 for about 45 minutes. This room is supposedly haunted by a ghost named Michael. While I was standing there, I kept talking to Michael, asking him to show me something, maybe play a joke or a trick. But nothing happened, even though my brother and husband were catching a lot of green orbs around me. Feeling a little disappointed, we headed back to the room. That's when something strange happened. As I got into bed, I found a deck of cards under my pillow. We had left it on the coffee table before leaving the room. Thinking maybe someone was playing a trick on me, I shrugged it off, put the cards back on the table in the other room, and went to sleep. The next day, we had a late start, so we refused maid service and went downtown to shop. We hadn't thought much about the deck of cards until we came back to the room that evening and saw the cards had been dealt into 4 hands on the coffee table. None of us had been back to the room, and we hadn't had maid service that day. The only reasonable explanation seemed to be that the hotel staff was messing with us, but we doubted that. The hotel's reputation as one of the most haunted in the U.S. would make it a huge liability for them to fake things like this. Now, we were starting to feel both spooked and skeptical. We sat in the living room, talking about all the possible ways this could have happened. I kept saying out loud that if there were any ghosts with us, I wanted them to show us something more. I even mentioned that I thought one of us might be playing a joke. While we were talking, my brother's girlfriend decided to rearrange the cards to check for any further disturbances. She put one joker on the top of the deck and one on the bottom, then placed the deck back in its case in the center of the table. My husband, convinced it was a prank by hotel staff, booby-trapped the front door with an empty vodka bottle. If anyone tried to enter without knowing it was there, they'd knock it over. We took plenty of pictures of the setup so we'd know if the bottle had moved. That night, we went out for dinner and drinks, returning around 11 p.m. My husband unlocked the door slowly and, without stepping inside, reached around to take a bunch of photos before touching the bottle. What we saw in those photos was unbelievable. Spread out in a row in front of the door were several cards face down, with 2 jokers face up. Meanwhile, the rest of the cards were still in the case on the coffee table, and the vodka bottle had not been disturbed. We were all stunned. Even days later, we're still trying to find a logical explanation for what happened. But it didn't end there. That night, we all hoped for more proof, for something to happen while we were in the room. But nothing did. The next morning, my husband woke up feeling even more skeptical because of the quiet night. I was the last one to use the bathroom before him, and everything seemed normal when I left. While he was showering, my brother, his girlfriend, and I went down to breakfast. About 30 minutes later, my husband joined us, looking upset. He accused us of messing with him by writing something on the bathroom mirror, but none of us had done anything. The word save was written on the mirror in a soap-like texture while my husband was in the shower. We still have no idea how any of this happened or what the word save could mean. Was Michael playing the joke on me that I'd asked for? Or did Norman Baker, who ran the hospital, have a habit of playing cards in his office? We can't figure it out, and would love to hear from anyone who's stayed in room 101 or experienced anything similar at the Crescent Hotel. When I was a kid, we had a huge family reunion every year in the Ozark Mountains of northwest Arkansas. Since I'm from southwest Arkansas, this was something we all looked forward to, especially because we got to see some of our favorite cousins. As we got older, my middle sister and I started bringing friends along. One of the things we loved doing during the reunion was visiting a local cemetery that dated back to the Civil War. Next to the cemetery was an old church that had also been used as a schoolhouse. It was very old, and most of the windows were boarded up. Of course, being curious kids, we had to check it out. Even though we'd been visiting the area for years, we had never actually tried to go inside. To understand this story, you need to know the layout of the church house. It was wide, with a breezeway running from the front door to the back. We entered through the back, so no one would see us. On the left side of the breezeway was the sanctuary, running the full length of the building, with 2 or 3 sets of doors leading in. I can't remember exactly. On the right side were several small rooms, probably once classrooms. Each room had a door from the breezeway, but the rooms were also interconnected, so you could walk from one room to the next without stepping back into the breezeway. So, we all entered and started looking around. Even though it was bright and sunny outside, the boarded-up windows made it pitch black inside. There were about 10 of us, and we were all a bit nervous because the old floor was rotting and giving way in some spots. We carefully made our way into the sanctuary, laughing and scaring each other along the way. The floor was littered with beer cans and junk food wrappers, clearly left by kids who had been partying there. Graffiti was scrawled all over the walls, which felt very disrespectful. We split up to explore. Well, I was mostly hiding my eyes in fear. There's even a picture of it. Then one of my cousins yelled for us to come into one of the classrooms. This room had a little light because someone had removed part of the board covering the window. Someone pointed out that one corner of the room felt much cooler than the rest. We all started joking around, walking through the cold spot and getting goosebumps. That's when I looked up and screamed. I saw a dismembered head floating in midair. Everyone screamed, but then started laughing. The head actually belonged to one of our friends, who was standing in the next room, looking at us through a hole in the wall. It wasn't dismembered at all. After calming down, we became more curious about the cold spot and started feeling like we were hearing strange sounds. Getting a little spooked, we decided it was time to leave. As we walked around the outside of the building, someone called out for us to look at the window. The same window in the room with the cold spot. At the bottom corner, we saw movement. Looking closer, we saw what seemed to be a small, pale hand waving at us. And just behind it, we could make out a tiny, pale face smiling at us. Needless to say, we ran out of there pretty fast. I've got a good story about the cemetery next to the church, but I'll save that for another time. Several years later, we visited the area again, and I wanted to take my kids to see the cemetery and the old church house, since they'd never been there. The church looked just as I remembered it, though a bit more rundown and rotted over the years. My younger cousins and my baby sister, who had been too young during the previous adventure, were with us this time. It was broad daylight and many of the windows were missing, so it was much brighter and less spooky. We didn't get to explore much because the floor had become very rotten. But something funny happened. My cousin Heather put a hand to her forehead and said in a dramatic voice, "I sense someone named Dan has been here." My cousin Shay, who can be a bit gullible, said, "Whoa, how do you know that?" My husband, now ex, pointed to some graffiti on the wall behind Shay that said, "Dan was here." We all burst out laughing. Last summer we returned again and were thrilled to see that the old church had undergone some renovation. Most of the floor had been replaced, so we were able to carry on our 20-plus year tradition and take a whole new generation to visit the old church house. Cherished memories indeed. This story is deeply personal and horrifying for me because I've lived through it. It's my experience with a demon in the house of my 95-year-old great-grandmother. But first, let me give you some background about myself and my family. I'm a Christian, and I believe in God wholeheartedly. I also believe that my spiritual gift from Him is the discernment of spirits. I've been sensitive to spirits my entire life, having strange, unexplainable intuitions that are always correct. I can sense entities and tell you whether they are good or evil. Over the years, I've battled with a deep fear of the unknown due to past experiences that would make your hair stand on end. So, while encounters with spirits aren't new to me, each new one brings its own terror, especially the one in my great-grandmother's house. No matter how used to these encounters you may be, there's nothing that can prepare you for the intense fear an evil spirit brings when it makes contact. The only thing that has helped me survive these moments is leaning on God, knowing that He is my protector and deliverer. His strength is the only reason I was able to endure the horrifying events in my great-grandmother's home. The house itself was built in the 1950s by my great-grandparents. It wasn't an old plantation-style home like in typical ghost stories. From the outside, it seemed like a normal, pleasant place where nothing majorly negative had ever happened. At least, that's what I thought at first. I later learned that my great-grandfather had affairs during his life, and that my grandparents used to throw wild parties in the 50s through the 80s, involving alcohol and possibly worse. I also knew that my great-great-grandfather, the father of my great-grandmother, was an atheist. He enjoyed mocking God, which made everyone around him uncomfortable. My great-uncle, who was obsessed with this grandfather, adopted the same views. Both of them were artists, as were many in our family line. Now, on to the events that still haunt me. During college, I would stay with my great-grandmother on weekends, as she could no longer be left alone in case she fell. This meant spending Friday night through early Monday morning at her house, 3 nights every weekend. In the beginning, everything felt normal. I slept well, and our routine was pleasant. We spent a lot of time together, and I was glad to help. But over time, I started to feel uneasy at night. I couldn't pinpoint what was causing it, but I had a gut feeling that something was wrong. Soon after, I started having evil dreams. In my nightmares, my great-grandmother would be possessed by a demon, and my little wiener dog, who always stayed with me, would also become possessed. In some dreams, my dog would even speak horrible things to me. These dreams always woke me up at 3 a.m., and I struggled to fall back asleep. I didn't share my fears with anyone, thinking they would find me silly, so I kept it to myself. But the anxiety grew. Eventually, I couldn't sleep at all in that house. I started taking Tylenol PM, building up such a tolerance that at one point, I was taking 6 pills a night with a mixed drink, but still couldn't sleep. My fear was unbearable. Then, things started happening. Physical things. The overhead lights would dim and brighten as I walked into different rooms. At first I thought it might be electrical, but when it started happening with table lamps and night lights too, I knew something was off. At night, I would hear loud bangs in other rooms. The TV would turn on to a fuzzy channel in the middle of the night without explanation. Lamps would switch on by themselves. My nightmares continued, and whenever I managed to sleep, I would be awoken by something shaking my bed. One night, as my bed was shaking, I heard a voice in my head saying, "Say Jesus." I believed God was telling me to be brave, so I said Jesus out loud, but my voice was shaky and uncertain. Immediately, something pushed down on my entire body, pressing me into the bed. It was the most disgusting and terrifying sensation I've ever felt, like evil static. That moment broke me. I felt hopeless. I left my grandmother asleep in the house, ran to my car, and drove around town until daylight. By morning, I returned, pretending like I had been there all night. The longer this went on, the more my demeanor changed. I became withdrawn, depressed, and lived in a state of constant fear. The house felt like it hated me, and it hated God too. Whenever I prayed or read the Bible, I felt its presence even stronger. I was afraid to call out to God, fearing it would make the spirit angrier. This went on for 2 years, with things escalating every weekend I stayed there. The last 2 weekends were the worst of my life. One weekend, after taking my usual, ineffective, Tylenol PM dose, I fell asleep. I dreamt that my dog was possessed and attacking me, screaming horrible things. I woke up at 3 a.m., as usual, and found my dog trembling next to me. The air was thick with evil, and when I moved, I realized the bed was soaked. My dog had peed in the bed. She had been house-trained for 8 years and never went indoors, so this was incredibly alarming. As I was cleaning up, I heard a whistling sound coming from the room we had been sleeping in. It sounded like someone calling a dog. I knew, without a doubt, that the spirit was trying to call my dog back into the room. I was physically ill from fear. We left the house that night, once again, not returning until daylight. The final weekend I stayed there, I was at my breaking point. While preparing to sleep, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a massive shapeless figure. My dog went berserk, barking and growling at it, confirming I wasn't imagining things. That night, after barely falling asleep, I was jolted awake by my dog barking furiously. I could feel the evil static in the house pressing down on me, almost paralyzed me. I prayed and rebuked it in the name of Jesus, but the feeling grew stronger, almost suffocating me. It felt like something was in the other room fighting with my dog. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my dog, ran out of the house, and drove away for the last time. I never stayed there again. Later, I discovered that my great-uncle had dabbled in voodoo and the occult, trying to communicate with his atheist grandfather. I found a shrine of occult items in his old room, including a voodoo doll. He had unknowingly invited something evil into the house. I took those items far away and destroyed them. I then blessed the house in the name of Jesus, praying over every corner, every door, and every window. Since then, I have felt peace there. I believe whatever evil was present is now banished. This experience was traumatizing, but it also strengthened my faith. I learned that with God, we can conquer anything, no matter how terrifying. The evil world has no power over the children of God. I've always wondered what to make of that day at the cabin back in the early 90s. After reading Jerry's account and seeing all the feedback from YGS readers, I figured I'd throw my own experience into the mix to see what everyone thinks. This was my first truly unexplained event. While it wasn't ghostly, it definitely felt paranormal. I've written about other things I and others have experienced at this cabin in ever since, but those events occurred between 2006 and 2014. This story, however, takes place in the early 90s. We have a cabin in the Ozark National Forest, nestled in the middle of 80 acres of forest. I've been enjoying the place since around 1988. Over the years, I'd go up there alone to do some deer hunting with my bow or rifle. On this particular occasion, I was by myself. I had a routine I followed on days like this. I'd get up before sunrise, have some coffee, take a descenting shower, get dressed, and head down to the lower part of the property to wait for daylight. I'd usually sit for a few hours, then head back to the cabin for a quick breakfast before heading up to the higher part of the land. At that time in my life, I worked construction, 4 10-hour days, which meant I had a 3-day weekend. Usually, I'd be alone at the cabin until some hunting buddies showed up later on Friday evening. But this particular Friday morning, I had already hunted the lower part of the 80 acres and made it back to the cabin. I added some wood to the stove, had breakfast, and around 10 a.m., I started easing up the road toward the upper part of the property. I had only made it about 20 yards up the road when a deer jumped out ahead of me, about 50 yards away. It didn't go very far, just off the road a bit. The leaves on the ground were as crunchy as potato chips, so I would have heard it if it had kept going. I froze, thinking about my next move, standing just beside a small cedar tree. There wasn't much wind, and it was in my favor as I stayed completely still. I could barely make out the tail end of the deer, and was waiting to see what it would do when I heard something odd. It sounded like a small helicopter, getting closer and closer to my position. The sound continued until it seemed like it was directly above me, maybe 25 feet up. I had a completely clear view straight to where the sound was coming from, and it was loud, but nothing was there. No movement, no wind disturbance. The cedar tree next to me wasn't moving, and neither were the leaves on the ground. The sound hovered above me for about 2 minutes, then suddenly moved up the road and veered off to the left, right where the deer had stopped. The deer went wild, blowing loudly and bolting off at full speed. I stood there, completely baffled. I had heard something right above me, and the deer had reacted to it too, but I couldn't see anything. Unsure of what to do, I continued with my plan and headed to the upper part of the property to hunt. About 20 minutes later, I was sitting at the base of a large oak tree, patiently waiting for deer to come my way. I kept replaying what had happened earlier in my head, trying to make sense of it. I'd been sitting there for about an hour and a half when I heard that sound again. It was heading right toward me. Just like before, the noise hovered directly above me, but I couldn't see anything. After about 2 to 3 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, stretched my arms out, and yelled, "What the?" The moment I did that, the sound sped off again, this time for good. I have no clue what it was. The sound reminded me of a single-prop aircraft of some kind, but it didn't sound like the drones we see nowadays. Could it have been a military drone? I don't know. If it was, it had to have some sort of cloaking device, because I couldn't see a thing. Based on the sound, I figured it was about the size of the drones we see today, but the cabin wasn't anywhere near a military facility. Was that kind of technology even available in the early 90s? So many unanswered questions. My one and only ghostly experience happened in the fall of 1986. At the time, I had lost most of my vision due to diabetes and had entered a residential rehabilitation facility in the capital city of a southern state. Rumors were common among the clients about odd occurrences on the campus, which spanned an entire city block. Because many clients came to the facility with serious medical conditions, there had been instances of people passing away in their dormitory rooms. Strange things were reported, like the elevator in the administration building, moving between floors on its own, even when only the business office manager was present. He'd rush out to see who was coming from the second floor, only to find the elevator empty every time. That, I figured, could be chalked up to an electrical glitch, rather than something paranormal. However, there was another incident involving the same office manager, along with 2 security guards during the facility's Christmas closure. They were chatting in the first-floor reception area of the training hall when they all heard what sounded like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor directly above them. They rushed to the second floor, only to find nothing out of place. That they couldn't explain. Now, My own experience took place in the dormitory hall where my room, along with 3 others, was located. At one end of the short hallway, there was a fire stairway that led either upstairs to the second-floor women's dorm rooms or outdoors to the courtyard. At the other end were double swinging doors that opened into the women's lounge on the first floor, which also led to the courtyard, or through another set of doors to the counseling hall. It was a Friday night, and I had just finished dinner. Using my white cane, I made my way out of the cafeteria through the reception area of the training hall, up a short set of stairs and into the counseling hall. I passed through the first set of swinging doors, crossed the women's lounge, and entered my hall through the second set of doors. My room was the first door on the left. The hallway was so short that you only needed 1 step to cross from my door to the door directly across from mine. I pulled out my room key and, using my left hand, found the keyhole. Just as I was about to insert the key with my right hand, I heard 5 distinct taps on the door across the hall, like someone tapping with a single finger. Feeling a little embarrassed that I hadn't noticed someone else in the hallway, I turned around, smiled, and said a friendly hello, but received no response. I stood there for a moment, puzzled, before shrugging it off and turning back to my door. But then a thought crossed my mind. The ladies in the room across the hall were also diabetic, and it was common for diabetics to be housed on the first floor in case they needed quick assistance. Perhaps one of them had knocked from the inside and needed help. I took the single step to their door, raised my hand to knock. But before I could, I heard the 5 taps again, this time from my side of the door. I was the only person in the hallway. Just then, I heard one of the women inside the room say, "Yes, someone's at the door. See who it is." When they opened the door, there I was, frozen in place with my hand still raised as if to knock. They asked me what I needed, and it took me a moment to find my voice. I knew what had just happened, but was struggling to process it. After I explained that I had heard tapping from the hallway, the 2 ladies said they had heard it too. We stood there, puzzled, until I nervously burst out laughing. I wasn't quite ready to accept what I knew in my heart had happened. I joked, "Oh, I know. Your guide dog must have been leaning against the door, causing the tapping sound." One of the ladies replied, "But neither of us has a guide dog." Then she mimicked the exact tapping sound we had all heard. I knew those taps had come from the hallway. The sound was at eye level, just a foot to my right. Had it been a real person, we would have been standing shoulder to shoulder. Together, the 3 of us tried to replicate the sound by going through the swinging doors, opening and closing the stairwell door, and even checking the doors leading to the courtyard. No matter what we did, we couldn't recreate the sound. That night, I slept with all the lights on in my room, despite not having vision. The following Monday, I caught up with the director of vocational training and asked her if anyone had ever passed away on that floor. She told me that years before, an older woman who had occupied one of the rooms on the far side of the women's lounge had gone to lie down after a double period of orientation and mobility training and had passed away in her sleep. When I told her what the 3 of us had experienced that Friday night, she made me promise not to share the story with other clients so as not to frighten them. I know what I heard. We all heard it. There's no rational explanation I can think of, except perhaps that a former, now departed client was paying a visit to one of her fellow dorm residents. From as far back as I can remember, I've had paranormal experiences. I realized at an early age that it was usually best to keep those experiences to myself. When I was just 4 years old, I told my grandma about one of them, and her reaction was harsh. She was offended, told me I needed God, and even called me pure evil. After that, I learned to ignore, shut out, or pretend these things didn't happen while I was growing up. It's never easy for me to share my stories. It takes a lot out of me. My hands sweat and my insides shake, not because I fear judgment or disbelief, but because I know that voicing these experiences gives them power, makes them stronger. The first story I want to share is about a little blue-eyed boy. As of October 2016, it's been 20 years since I was visited by this child. The day started like any other weekday. I woke up early, got my 4 kids up, fixed them breakfast, and sent them off to school. My husband usually worked nights, but that week he was on day shifts. I was excited to have the house to myself for a change, a rare opportunity to enjoy some peace and quiet. We had moved into the house less than a month before, and I had been working non-stop to get everything organized. I was more than ready for a me day. I quickly tidied up the house, made the beds, vacuumed, and started the laundry. Then I headed into the living room to do something I'd been wanting to do for weeks. So, I set up my sewing machine on the table, spread the fabric on the floor, and began pinning my pattern to it. As I started cutting out the pieces, I suddenly heard a giggle. I looked up just in time to see a beautiful little boy standing at the top of the steps leading into the living room. My first thought was that he must have wandered in through the other front door. He was filthy, dirt smudged on his cheeks, all over his blue overalls, which were only strapped on one side, the other hanging loosely at his side. His shirt was a faded yellow and white checkered pattern. But what stood out the most were his eyes, vivid, astonishingly blue. He looked to be about 18 months, maybe 2 years old, with blonde hair sticking up messily, also streaked with dirt. He seemed so real, there was no reason for me to think he was a ghost. I laughed and asked, "Where did you come from?" He giggled again. I glanced away for a second as I got up off the floor, but when I looked back, he was gone. Yet I could still hear his giggles trailing off. I walked through the house, calling out for him. I checked the doors, thinking he might have slipped back outside. The door in the playroom, the one we call the other front door, was still locked. I looked in closets, under beds, all while calling for him. After what felt like a very long time, I started checking the windows to see if one had been left open. But I never found him. The little blue-eyed boy was gone, and I've never seen him again since that day. Yet I can still picture him perfectly in my mind. I'm not sure if he's still here, but sometimes, when the musical rocking horse in my granddaughter's playroom starts playing on its own, I imagine it's him, just having a good time, playing like any other child. After seeing the little boy I told you about in my previous story, the little blue-eyed boy, nothing significant happened in our home for years. Occasionally, things would go missing, only to turn up later exactly where they should have been. Items like my kitchen colander, serving forks, and spoons, all of which were bright silver. I often told myself that I had just overlooked them, that they were there the whole time. But deep down, I knew better. Sometimes, denial is the easiest way to cope with things we can't explain. It's important to understand that this was the first home my husband and I bought together. We wanted it to be a safe haven for our children to grow up in. I didn't want to spoil that by telling them about the little boy or the missing items. So I stayed quiet and kept denying. We bought the house in 1996, and at that time it was nearly 30 years old. Since I grew up around here, I either knew the people who had lived in the house before us, or had heard of them. I couldn't recall any tragedies like murders or fires happening there, so I was fairly certain of the home's history. The next significant event happened in the late summer or early fall of 2008. A few years before, my sister had given my daughter a puppy. We were told he would grow to be no more than 3 pounds, but he ended up weighing around 50 pounds. Over the next 3 years, he gradually became more of my dog. I was the one who took care of him, and he became very protective of me. In fact, I was the only person who could move his food bowl while he was eating without him snapping. But as time passed, the dog grew more aggressive. If we had visitors, we had to kennel him, and there were times when he would pace around the house growling at nothing for hours. I thought about putting him down many times, but my heart always got in the way. Sometimes, we let our emotions cloud our judgment, and we end up making decisions we regret. One night, my youngest son, oldest daughter, and I were in the living room watching TV. My daughter was lying on the sofa when the dog came into the room and started his usual pacing and growling. She called him over and lifted her hand to pet him, trying to calm him down. Instead, he snapped at her face and tore her lips so badly that she needed 14 stitches. My husband and her husband rushed her to the ER, while I stayed behind, waiting for their return. Guilt washed over me as I sat down at my computer, struggling to process what had happened. I had kept a dog I knew was dangerous, and now he had hurt my child. I felt like a terrible person for putting an animal before the safety of my family. As I sat there, consumed by guilt and worry, I broke down. I kept thinking about how irresponsible I had been. Then suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder. It started softly rubbing my back, and for a moment it was comforting. But it only lasted a minute at most. At first I thought it was my husband, but then I realized there was no way they could be back so soon. I turned around to see who it was, but no one was there. The dog was put down the next day. After that, the paranormal activity in our home increased to the point where we even considered having a team come in to investigate. After my dog attacked my daughter, we made the difficult decision to have him put down. I couldn't risk letting another family take him, knowing what he was capable of. Perhaps that was the trigger for the series of more intense paranormal events that followed. Several members of my family began seeing shadowy black figures. My youngest daughter frequently woke up at night to find a very tall, dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. When she turned on her bedside lamp, it would vanish. We tried to recreate this figure, thinking it might be something in her room or her imagination playing tricks. But nothing we did could explain what she was seeing. Not long after that, or while it was still happening, I started noticing a tall, dark shadow figure in the corner of my kitchen. I would usually catch a glimpse of it over my shoulder, a quick, fleeting look. But when I turned around fully, it was always gone. At first, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, perhaps a reaction to what my daughter had been experiencing. But then, our two remaining dogs began avoiding that corner of the kitchen at all costs. I'll get into more about that in my next story. Strange things continued happening. Shadow figures, items disappearing, a tugging sensation on the back of our legs as we walked down the hall. We would hear voices, faint and distant. Sometimes one of my kids, usually my youngest, would come into the living room and ask what I wanted, insisting they had heard me calling them. This actually started the moment we moved into the house, hearing someone call out our names, but we always brushed it off as our imaginations. Something unusual occurred every single day. I probably won't capture it all here because much of it seemed trivial at the time, and a lot of it I've since forgotten. I'm sure it will come back to me eventually. I had been through things like this before, so I just learned to shrug it off and continue with life. But then came the night of December 16, 2009. I remember it clearly because it's also my wedding anniversary. That night, my oldest daughter and her husband had just moved in with us. Their bedroom was down the hall from ours, while my youngest daughter's room was directly across the hall from mine. My youngest son's room was at the far end of the hall. I should note here that my oldest son, who had also had experiences, but is a complete non-believer, had moved out several years before. I woke up at exactly 2:22 a.m. I know the time because I immediately looked at the clock. What woke me was the sound of an ice cream truck playing the tune, "Do Your Ears Hang Low." My first thought was, why on earth is an ice cream truck running in the middle of the night? As the sound grew louder, I got out of bed and opened my bedroom door. The music sounded like the truck was inside the house and coming toward me. At that moment, my oldest daughter opened her bedroom door. She looked at me with wide eyes as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She asked, "Do you hear that?" By now, the sound was deafening. I'm not even sure if I actually heard her words or just read her lips. And then, suddenly, it stopped. We were both completely shaken. We kept asking each other, did that really just happen? Neither of us went back to bed that night. We stayed up talking, trying to find a reasonable explanation for what we just experienced. We were baffled as to why no one else in the house woke up. But the one question we didn't think to ask at the time was, why would an ice cream truck be running in December? A few days later, it hit me. Our local ice cream truck only runs in the spring and summer. Just to be sure, I called the owner and asked about his operations schedule. He confirmed that the trucks run from noon until 8 p.m., March 1st through September 1st. I'm taking a short break from writing about the occurrences in my home to share a story that took place at my sister's house many years ago. There's a reason I feel compelled to write about it now. I received a phone call from my sister last night after trying to reach her all day. I'd left 3 phone calls and 3 text messages, all with the same simple message: we need to talk. The date today is April 18th, 2016. Here's a bit of our conversation. My sister: hey, are you busy? Me: no. What's up? Nice of you to finally return my calls. My sister: sorry, my brain's been preoccupied. Do you remember that Christmas Eve when my house almost went up in flames? Are you kidding me? Are you freaking kidding me? I've been trying to reach you all day about that. My sister: all I've been able to think about today is that night. You really need to stop playing in my head. But there's so much room in there. You're so funny. Have you seen him again? My sister: no. Have you? No. That last question is like a ritual between us whenever one of us brings up that night. I don't think either of us really expects to see him again, but it's a question that just has to be asked. It all began on Christmas Eve, 1989. That morning, my husband and I woke up to a very cold house. The power was out, and our water pipes were frozen. Winter was hitting harder than I could ever remember in Arkansas, with temperatures dropping into the teens or lower. At the time, we had 2 children, a 5-year-old boy and a 6-month-old girl, and we knew we had to get them somewhere warm. We lived in the country, so heading to a hotel wasn't a viable option, especially with freezing drizzle making travel dangerous. We considered going to my parents' house about 6 miles away, but we figured they were probably without power as well. Our other option was my sister's house, which was also about 6 miles in the other direction. We knew her house would be warm because she heated with wood. Once we decided on my sister's house, my husband gathered the Santa gifts while I bundled the kids up. We loaded the car and set out. Let me tell you a bit about my sister's house. I was with her the day she found it in 1981. We were driving around looking for a rental for her family when we came across an overgrown gravel road neither of us had driven down since we were kids. We noticed what looked like a forgotten driveway, so we stopped, got out of the car, and walked as far as we could. Peeking through the overgrowth of wild ivy and grapevines, we saw it, a magnificent old house just waiting to be loved. The yard was covered in overgrown rose bushes that hadn't been pruned in years. Straight in front of the steps leading up to the large porch was an arched trellis covered in velvety, blood-red roses. We approached the house cautiously, fully aware that we were trespassing. But since we didn't see any posted signs, we figured it was okay to take a quick look. It was as if the house wanted us to see it, as if it were calling out to us. The front porch spanned the width of the house, with large columns supporting the roof. There were old, worn porch swings on either end. The house had 2 front doors. Looking through the door on the right, we could see 2 large rooms separated by an arched doorway, each with its own fireplace. The floors were hardwood, though they had long lost their shine. Through the left door, we saw a bedroom, equally as large as the other 2 rooms, with the same hardwood floors. We were like kids, running around trying to peek into windows, imagining what other surprises the house held. My sister became obsessed, already planning how she would decorate it. She was determined to rent the house, no matter how many times I tried to talk her into looking elsewhere. After several days, she finally tracked down the owner. People told her the house had been in the family for over 100 years, and while it had been rented out in the past, the owner wasn't likely to rent it again because the last tenants hadn't taken care of it. Despite the odds, my sister convinced me to go with her to speak with the owner. The lady wasn't eager to rent it out, explaining that the house needed a lot of repairs and that the yard was overgrown. My sister promised to handle the repairs and the yard work, refusing to take no for an answer. Finally, as a last-ditch effort, the owner said, "It's haunted. Previous renters have seen and heard things." My sister just smiled at me and said, "Awesome." The owner laughed and agreed to rent it to her. Now, back to Christmas Eve morning, 1989. We made our way slowly down the icy gravel road to my sister's house. By this time, the trees were beginning to freeze over, and I was grateful to have a warm place to take the kids. Even though we hadn't called ahead, I knew my sister would welcome us with open arms, and she did. We spent the day baking and getting ready for Santa's visit. The house was filled with the laughter and excitement of 4 kids, with the occasional giggle from our baby girl. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, I heard my son coughing. It was almost midnight. When I went to check on him, I smelled smoke. The smoke was coming from the closet, which shared a wall with the fireplace in the other room. I yelled for everyone, thinking the house was on fire. While my husband and I got the kids up, my sister and brother-in-law inspected the closet. My brother-in-law thought the fire was contained in the chimney, but to be safe, we all went outside. We bundled the kids into one of the cars to keep them warm, while my brother-in-law and husband grabbed an extension ladder. My sister and I stretched the water hose toward the house, only to find it frozen. We then used a pail, filling it with water from the yard's faucet. Luckily, it wasn't frozen, and passed it up to my brother-in-law, who was on the roof pouring it down the chimney. It was during one of these trips that I noticed someone else on the roof besides my brother-in-law. My sister saw him too. I asked, "Who is that?" And she responded, "Where did he come from?" We handed the pail up to the man, who didn't turn to face us, but simply said, "Here, let me help." He was standing right next to the chimney. My brother-in-law gave him the pail, and the man poured it down the chimney. After a few more trips, the fire was out. My brother-in-law turned toward the man to thank him, but he was gone, just vanished. We searched the roof and the yard, but there were no footprints in the newly fallen sleet, except for my brother-in-law's. The man had been wearing jeans, a long-sleeve shirt, a vest, and cowboy boots. He didn't seem to mind the cold. I can't remember ever seeing his face, just his profile. His voice was flat, and there's always been a debate about his hair color. My brother-in-law says it was black, but my sister and I remember it being dark blonde. My husband, who was on the ladder the whole time, never saw him but says he definitely heard him talking. One thing we all agree on: there's no way that man could have jumped off the roof or climbed down the ladder without us noticing. He simply wasn't there anymore. I've encountered several unusual experiences throughout my life, each one pushing me to believe in things that might otherwise seem like nothing more than campfire stories. Some of these experiences have been terrifying, while others have left me with a curious hope that there's more to this world than we can perceive. 16 years ago, my parents bought an old farmhouse in a small town in Arkansas. The house was over 100 years old at the time. Within a week of moving in, strange things started happening. We'd hear footsteps echoing through the house and up in the attic. Over time, we'd see doors open and close on their own, accompanied by the familiar creak of floorboards as something invisible moved through the house, sometimes passing right in front of us. We even heard 3 distinct voices: a man, a woman, and a little girl whose laughter we heard several times. But this story isn't about all those occurrences. It's about one particular experience that has haunted me for over 10 years. When I was in high school, I began thinking seriously about my future. My mother encouraged me to pursue architecture, and I did. But I needed scholarships, so I volunteered as a custodian at my high school, eventually completing nearly 100 hours of volunteer work. During that time, I had numerous unsettling experiences, but one stands out as the most haunting. Part of my job involved closing the school at night, which meant cleaning 4 different buildings. I always left the gyms for last, since they required the least work. Many times, I heard the sound of people running on the basketball court, even though all the doors were locked, and I had the only key. Every time I walked out of the locker rooms to investigate, the noise would stop, and the gym floor would be completely empty. One night, after finishing up in the high school gym, which was connected to the lobby lined with large glass windows, something happened that I will never forget. Even though the lights in the gym were off, the light from the lobby illuminated the gym floor. As I was walking down the aisle toward the lobby, I saw a figure on the opposite side of the gym, walking toward the locker rooms. At first, I thought it might be my own shadow reflecting off the bleachers. But when I stopped walking, the figure kept moving. It was nothing more than a thick gray mass, and I could vaguely see through it because I could still see the reflections on the bleachers as it walked by. I was frozen in place. What I was seeing didn't make any sense. Then the figure reached the end of the aisle, placed its left hand on the railing, and turned to look directly at me. Its eyes were piercing, glowing white, and they locked onto mine for about 10 seconds. Then it stepped 1 foot onto the gym floor and vanished right in front of me. I know what I saw, but I have no idea what it was or what it wanted. That experience, along with many others, has forced me to believe there's more to this world than we can explain. I try not to get too philosophical, but sometimes I wonder, wouldn't it be disappointing if we knew all the secrets of the universe? Since that night, I haven't encountered anything quite like that figure again. I can't say I want to, but it's left me wondering about the nature of the unknown. I've come across other stories of people experiencing similar spirits, but none of us really know what they are or why they appear. I believe this next occurrence happened in 2011. It was nighttime, and I was home alone, something I had come to dread, especially after dark. I wasn't the only one who felt this way. Both of my daughters refused to stay in the house by themselves. That night, my husband was at work on the second shift, so he wouldn't be home until around midnight. The rest of the family was out doing their own thing. Whenever I was home alone, I tried to keep myself busy to avoid letting my mind wander. Sitting still and watching TV felt too vulnerable, like I was a sitting duck. I was in the kitchen washing dishes. My 2 dogs, a basset hound and a lab, were asleep on the dining room floor. They were my loyal buddies, always by my side. Suddenly, I heard them stir and figured they wanted to go outside. I turned around to see both of them walking toward me, but something was off. Their heads were lowered, and their tails were tucked between their legs. I dried my hands, ready to take them out, when I saw him, Shadow Man. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of him standing in the corner between the living room door and the laundry room door. When I turned to face him fully, he vanished. I tried to stay calm, telling myself, this is no big deal. I've seen him before. Don't let it freak you out. So, I turned back to the sink, forgetting for a moment that I was supposed to take the dogs out. But they didn't seem interested in going outside anymore. Instead, they sat on either side of me, facing the wall across the room. My basset hound started growling softly, and my lab, who is mute, let out his little whimper. Both of them were clearly upset. I walked over to the refrigerator, which was right next to the corner where Shadow Man had been. I took a quick glance at the spot. Nothing. To distract the dogs and myself, I got some ice out of the freezer. Ice cubes were one of their favorite treats, and I figured it might calm them down. Sure enough, they perked up and sat eagerly in front of the fridge, waiting for their ice cubes. We played a little game of catch with the ice cubes, me trying to stay composed while my heart was racing. At one point, an ice cube bounced off one of the dogs' noses and slid into the laundry room doorway, right next to that same corner. Both dogs immediately stopped playing and looked at me, then at the ice cube, and back at me again. I gave them the command, go get it, but they refused to move. I repeated, fetch, but again they just whimpered and stared at the ice cube. The 3 of us stood there, frozen, staring at that ice cube as if we were under a spell. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack. The dogs were shivering and whimpering, clearly afraid. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the moment broke. My oldest daughter and her husband walked through the front door, and it was like the spell was lifted. I immediately took the dogs outside. When we came back inside, they avoided the corner and the ice cube, going straight back to their beds in the dining room. The next morning, I finally cleaned up the water from the melted ice cube. Somehow, it seemed to take forever to melt, though I knew it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. This wasn't the first time I'd seen Shadow Man. He seems to lurk in that same corner quite often, and over the years, I've just learned to ignore him. Other members of my family have seen shadow figures too. They seem relatively harmless, but it's still unsettling to know they're watching you. The following occurrences took place in early 2011. At the time, E, our youngest daughter, and Z, our youngest son, were still living at home. One evening, our oldest daughter and her husband came over for dinner and a movie night. Z's girlfriend was also there. About halfway through the movie, E decided to take a shower and head to bed since she had to get up early for classes the next day. She mentioned she'd use my shower so that the hallway bathroom would be free for anyone else. The rest of us watched the movie until it ended. Afterward, I went to the kitchen to grab drinks for everyone. As I walked into the kitchen, I heard a faint cry. It alarmed me, and my first thought was of E. I quickly made my way down the hall and peeked into her bedroom, but she wasn't there. Thinking she was still in the shower, I headed toward my room. The moment I walked in, I heard E scream, "Mom." I rushed to the bathroom and opened the door to find E sitting on the shower floor, almost hysterical, screaming, "I can't get the shower door open." I grabbed the handle to help her, but the moment I touched it, a sharp electric static sensation shot through my hand and arm, causing me to drop my arm in pain. Then, strangely, the door easily slid open. E explained that she had been washing her hair when she heard the bathroom door open. She called out, saying she was in the bathroom, but when she glanced through the frosted shower door, the room door appeared to be closed. Then she thought she heard a low, deep laugh, which freaked her out. She decided to cut her shower short and tried to open the shower door, but it wouldn't budge. She said she pushed, shoved, and even kicked the door, but it simply wouldn't open. My husband and I both tested that shower door multiple times afterward. We tried slamming it, closing it softly, anything to get it to stick. But no matter what we did, we couldn't replicate what had happened. There was no reasonable explanation for why the door wouldn't open that night. I'm not sure if this had any connection to what happened earlier, but a few weeks before E's shower incident, she had received a text message from an unknown number that simply read, "I'm watching you." We reported it to the police, but they said it was impossible to trace. A few days after E's experience in the shower, I had an unsettling experience of my own. I was taking a hot shower, and the steam had filled the bathroom, creating a thick fog that hovered above the shower door. I heard the bathroom door open softly, and assuming it was my husband, I didn't think much of it. But then I heard what sounded like a giggle. Curious, I opened the shower door and looked out into the foggy room. Right in the middle of the steam, I saw a dense section of fog shaped like a figure, about 3 feet tall. I stood there, frozen, watching as the shape lifted what appeared to be an arm. Mesmerized, I didn't move for what felt like a minute. Slowly, the dense section began to dissipate, blending back into the rest of the fog. I shut the shower door and tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild. A few minutes later, I attempted to open the shower door, but it wouldn't move. I shoved, kicked, and leaned against it, but it was stuck. Finally, after a few more tries, the door popped open. By then, the fog had completely cleared. As I stepped out of the shower, I noticed a small opening in the window curtain, just enough to give me a view of my neighbor's back porch steps. Lounging on his elbow on the steps was a grayish, hairless, skinny man with a grinning, almost toothless face. He waved at me. In the blink of an eye, he vanished. I've never told anyone about that man, not until now. He looked dead. I still don't know if it was just my imagination or if the light played tricks on me, but I'll never forget it. A few months later, at my insistence, my husband and youngest son demolished the shower and completely remodeled the bathroom. On February 22nd, 1993, at 2:01 p.m., I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. It wasn't an easy pregnancy. I had morning sickness the entire time and gained only 11 pounds, which put me in the high-risk category. Unsurprisingly, her birth didn't go as planned. I was induced at 36 weeks because she had stopped growing. Thankfully, after 4 hours of labor, I delivered a surprisingly healthy baby girl. But 3 hours later, I began hemorrhaging severely, and my blood pressure dropped dangerously low. The doctors told my husband and me that if the bleeding didn't stop within the next few hours, I would need surgery. My nurse, Wendy, started giving me shots of Pitocin every 30 minutes to help stop the bleeding. After 2 shots, there was no change. I was too weak to focus, and everything around me felt surreal, likely because of my low blood pressure. A calm sense of acceptance washed over me, and I remember thinking I might die. Before her shift ended, Wendy came in to check on me. She had been the attending nurse for 3 of my children, and assured me that another nurse would take over, giving me the shots. She promised to check on me the next morning before she left. It was 6 o'clock in the evening when the new nurse came into my room. Her name tag read Maria, though I don't remember seeing a last name. She was a short woman, about 5 feet tall, with short brown hair streaked with gray and the most beautiful blue eyes. Her soft, comforting voice was unlike anything I've ever heard before or since. I rolled over, thinking she was there to give me my next shot. Even though I had been so weak I couldn't lift my arms moments earlier, I managed to move. But Maria smiled and said, "Oh, honey, I'm not giving you a shot. You don't need another one. You're going to be just fine." She stood next to my bed, smiling and gently rubbing my legs for a few minutes. I glanced at my husband, intending to ask if he had heard what she said, but he was sound asleep in a chair. I looked at the clock. It read 6:05. When I turned back to Maria, she smiled, patted my leg, and walked toward the door. But as I watched, she didn't walk out. She simply vanished. I thought maybe I had dozed off for a second, but when I checked the clock again, it read 6:06. My husband was still asleep, so I tried calling his name, but he didn't respond. Desperate to get his attention, I grabbed a thermometer from the bedside table and tossed it at him. It landed on his chest, but still, he didn't wake up. At that moment, Nurse Sheila came into the room, carrying a familiar syringe. I told her I didn't need any more pitocin, explaining that the last nurse had told me so. Sheila looked confused and asked, "What nurse?" She said she was the only one on duty that night. When she asked me to describe the nurse I had seen, I could only remember Maria. She looked concerned, glanced at the empty bassinet at the foot of my bed, and asked if my baby was in the nursery. When I confirmed that she was, Sheila looked visibly relieved and rushed out of the room. A short time later, Sheila returned with 2 other nurses. They stood at my door, whispering and looking in at me. Then all 3 entered the room and began firing questions at me so quickly that it scared me. I panicked, thinking that Maria had tried to kidnap my baby. The commotion woke my husband, who was confused as to why he was holding a thermometer. To this day, he swears he doesn't remember falling asleep, only that the room suddenly felt freezing before he nodded off. The nurses reassured me that my baby was safe in the nursery. Nurse Sarah, one of the older nurses, instructed the others to bring my daughter to me. While we waited, she took my blood pressure, and then turned to Nurse Sheila, telling her to put away the syringe and call the doctor. I wouldn't need that shot, after all. When my baby was brought in, Nurse Sarah sat next to me as I cradled her. She asked if this was my first baby, and I told her it was my 4th. She smiled and asked about my older children, and I started to feel calmer. But just as I thought she was about to tell me something important, my doctor came in. He checked me over, amazed at how quickly I had recovered. He even remarked that my color had returned. After a few moments of staring at me in disbelief, he asked, "Are you hungry?" When I said yes, he told me he'd order a pizza on his way out. After he left, Nurse Sarah stayed a while longer. She leaned in and said quietly, "I've never talked to anyone Maria has visited before." She looked at me closely, as if deciding whether or not to continue. I didn't say a word, but I knew. I'm not sure how or why, but I just knew. Nurse Sarah explained that Maria had been a nurse on the maternity floor years ago. She told me, the story goes that Maria was called into work one stormy night, but she never made it here. They say she sometimes visits new moms, and everyone describes her the same way. She looked down for a moment, as if in prayer, then shook her head and added, "Who am I to question these things?" Before she left, patted my leg and said, "They say she only visits special people." The next day, much to everyone's surprise, I was released from the hospital in excellent health. As my husband and I walked down the corridor with our baby daughter, I could feel eyes on us. Some whispered, while others stared. Maybe they thought I was a lunatic, or maybe they were just wondering, why her? This story is a special part of me. I know that night I experienced something most people never do, and for that, I am extremely grateful. Growing up, my daughters loved hearing this story, especially E. Whenever kids would boast about their birth weights, E would proudly say, "I almost killed my mom." When I turned 14, I invited 2 of my closest friends over to my mom's house for a birthday sleepover. We spent the evening doing what we loved, watching horror movies, playing a game called Nightmare and enjoying my Nightmare Before Christmas-themed cake. Everything was fine until the middle of the night when I heard a scream. I assumed it was my aunt being loud and obnoxious. She had come home with a friend, likely after a night of drinking, since she was living with us at the time. The next morning, something felt off. I glanced around my room, and my eyes landed on the elevated shelf across the room, where I had placed a Jack Skellington fondant sculpture that I was preserving in a clear coffin. Jack had been torn apart. His body was held together with sticks and sticky cake material, so there was no way he could have just fallen apart on his own. His body parts were completely whole, just no longer attached to each other, and the coffin was still sealed shut. None of us had touched him, so I had no idea what could have done it. Curious, I asked my aunt what the scream was about the night before. She looked at me confused and said she thought we were the ones screaming. It wasn't a scream of danger, more like a scared scream. Then she told me that before they came home, she and her friend had played with a Ouija board. Since they were drinking, they assumed the other person was just messing around, moving the planchette. She went on to say that after they went to bed, her dog, Lily, went crazy near her closet door, moving around the room as if she were following something. When they turned off the lights to go to sleep, they started hearing scratching noises on the walls and a loud clatter near the radio. Lily whimpered, and her friend immediately jumped onto the bed. Lily followed, and the three of them ended up huddled on a twin bed. My aunt grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight, and shined it toward the radio. Everything, including the speakers, had been turned around. My aunt moved out when she got married, and I ended up moving into her room. That's when things got weirder. The closet in that room quickly became a hot spot for strange occurrences. One day after school, my brother and I were hanging out in my room when we heard a loud thump, like something heavy had fallen in the closet. The door was closed, so, against all my better judgment, I decided to check it out. I walked over slowly and then yanked the door open, hoping that by opening it quickly, whatever was inside wouldn't have time to react. But when I looked, there was nothing. Just a neatly folded trash bag poncho lying in the middle of the closet floor. At night, things got even creepier. I would hear footsteps, but they always seemed to be just outside my bedroom door, which I kept open for obvious reasons. One night, I got up to use the bathroom, and I heard those same noises again. I walked cautiously to the door and stood just to the side of the frame, too scared to look around the doorway. It was dark, and I could only make out outlines, but the fear was real. Panicked, I ran back to bed. As soon as I did, the noises stopped. I sat straight up in bed, staring hard at the doorway, trying to see through the wall as if my focus alone could reveal what was lurking. I fought the urge to go to the bathroom for a long time, but eventually I couldn't hold it anymore. I got up and walked slowly toward the door again, but this time there were no noises. The bathroom was only 5 steps from my room, so I took huge, careful strides, trying not to make a sound. But then I heard the noises again, inside my room. It felt like whatever it was toying with me. Instinctively, I sprinted the last 2 steps to the bathroom, my chest tight with that familiar jumpy feeling. I slammed the door, locked it, and turned on the light. I stayed in the bathroom for what felt like forever, trying to convince myself to go back to bed, but the fear was overwhelming. I even considered just sleeping in the bathroom, but eventually, I decided to leave the light on and venture back to my room. From the bathroom, I could see my bed, illuminated by the bathroom light. I walked slowly to the frame of my bedroom door, ran my hand along the wall to find the light switch, and flicked it on. There was nothing. Nothing in the closet, nothing under the bed. I crawled into bed with the light on and finally forced myself to sleep. It all started when I was very young. My mother always considered me an old soul because of the way I analyzed things and how I acted. I vividly remember once going through her closet when I was about 3 years old, and when she asked what I was doing, I replied, "When you get to be as old as I am, you'll understand." My mother later confirmed that this memory wasn't a dream. One of the most vivid memories of my childhood, however, involves a little boy I used to play with. I always thought he was my imaginary friend because that's what my family told me. It didn't help that I'd say things like, "He's growing just like I am," and no one took it seriously. When I got a little older and stopped playing with him, he still visited me in my dreams. We would talk, laugh, and he was there for me during tough times, even fighting alongside me in my nightmares. To help you picture him, he had thick brown hair and honey hazel eyes. His crooked smile always made me feel comforted. Then one day, the dreams stopped. Maybe it was because my emotions were too overwhelming, or I was trying to block everything out. I don't know, but I remember feeling lonely without him and trying to convince myself that I was too old for such things anyway. Years later, after my grandmother passed away, she visited me in a dream. It's hard to believe it's been that long, but I think I was around 18 at the time. My grandmother was the kind of person who loved making things. She had made my baby blanket, which I still have tucked away safely, planning to one day pass it on to my own child. In the dream, my grandmother and I were walking around the old schoolhouse in front of her home. Suddenly, I heard the sound of someone running on the gravel. My grandmother turned, smiling, so I turned to see what she was looking at. There, running toward us, was a tall man with darker brown hair and honey hazel eyes, the same boy from my childhood, now grown. I blinked, realizing who he was, and smiled. I asked my grandmother if she knew him. Her response puzzled me. "Yes, dear, I know him, and you will too soon." I was confused. I thought I already knew him. Before I could argue, I noticed he was holding my baby blanket, the one my grandmother had made for me. He wrapped it around her shoulders and said they had to go, but he would visit me from time to time. As they walked away toward the park, I watched them slowly fade into the distance. Then I woke up. I didn't tell my parents about the dream. My grandmother had been my father's mother, and both my parents were still grieving her loss. The dream kept nagging at me, though. Why did he have my baby blanket? And why did my grandmother say I would come to know him? I waited, night after night, hoping he would return in my dreams. When he finally did, I asked him for his name. He gave me a sad smile and said, "I was never given a name." That confused me. I had called him something when I was little, but I couldn't remember what it was. All my imaginary friends had names, so it didn't make sense that he didn't. But I didn't dwell on it for long, and the dream continued. One morning, however, everything clicked. My mother was crying about a story she had read about a woman who miscarried. I asked if she was okay, and she told me she was just sad. Then, out of nowhere, she turned to me and said, "You're a rainbow baby, you know. I had a miscarriage right before you." She went on to explain that she had lost the baby around the 3-month stage and drew me a picture of what it would have looked like. She said she got pregnant with me almost immediately afterward. The room seemed to tilt on its side, something that always happens when I feel a huge confirmation of something. I swallowed my feelings and asked her if she ever thought about what she would have named the baby. She hadn't really considered it, but she said she liked the names Ian and Vincent. I went to my room, trying to process everything. The miscarriage would have overlapped with me, meaning I might not have been born at all, or been born premature. I thought about how my father always wanted a boy and how they named me after him to make up for it. Then I realized my imaginary friend had been my brother all along. That night, I dreamed of him again. In the dream, I was sitting up in bed, watching him come into the room. He looked sad, and I told him I was angry at my mom for never telling me about him. She didn't know he would have been a boy, but I knew. When I saw that little sketch she had drawn, I immediately saw his face in my mind. I told him I had found a name for him. He sat beside me and asked, "What's my name?" "Ian Vincent," I told him. His face lit up and he said, "I like it." I knew he would. Before I woke up, he promised to come back, and though he hasn't visited as often as before, I can still feel his presence throughout the day in little moments. As my grandmother said, I know him. I always have. I went through a grieving process after realizing I had spent so much time with the brother I never knew I had. We weren't twins, but in a way, we were. I've told my close friends about him, and even used photo software to create a likeness of him, as I remembered him when we were younger, and as he is now.